Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Today we'll take a look at the Malfoy family from an unexpected angle. Yes, in the pages of the Harry Potter saga, they were portrayed as arrogant wizards loyal to Voldemort. But there were moments when their actions defied the cold-blooded antagonist image. Let's recall the times when the Malfoys showed humanity and even nobility. Enjoy watching. Number 1, Narcissa saved Harry. Not out of pity, but out of love. Narcissa Malfoy was never truly a Death Eater. Yes, she shared Voldemort's ideology, but deep down she was first and foremost a mother. Her most powerful moment came in the Forbidden Forest when she lied to Voldemort and claimed that Harry was dead. She didn't do it for him. She did it to find out if her son Draco was still alive. Once she received a positive answer, she chose to spare the young Potter's life. That decision changed the course of the entire war. Number 2. Draco didn't give Harry away, even though he knew. When Harry, Hermione and Ron were brought to Malfoy Manor, it was Draco they looked to for confirmation of their identities. He could have pointed to the scar, to the familiar face, and turned them over to the Death Eaters. But he didn't. Maybe he hesitated. Maybe he didn't want the responsibility. But the fact remains, he saved Harry by refusing to confirm his identity. Number 3, he didn't abandon Goyle when he passed out. In the scene inside the Room of Requirement, things spiraled out of control. Crabbe unleashed the Fiendfire curse, and the fire consumed everything in its path. But Draco, instead of saving only himself, grabbed the unconscious Goyle and tried to drag him out of the inferno. In that moment, he wasn't a cowardly pureblood heir. He was a person with compassion and a sense of duty. Number 4, Lucius and Narcissa refused to fight for Voldemort. During the final battle of Hogwarts, the Malfoys walked away from Voldemort. Some say they fled, but it can also be seen as a conscious decision to stop serving evil. They didn't fight, they didn't kill, they no longer cared about power, only about their son's safety, and perhaps that too is a form of courage, the strength to walk away when you realize you've gone too far. Number 5, Draco became a Death Eater only to protect his family. In his 6th year, Draco was trapped. Voldemort used him as a tool to pressure Lucius and Narcissa, assigning the boy an almost impossible mission. Becoming a Death Eater was not a choice, but a necessity to protect his loved ones. And despite everything, Draco could never bring himself to become a killer. Number 6, he couldn't kill Dumbledore. No matter how much anger, fear, or pride Draco carried, on the astronomy tower, he couldn't pull the trigger. He stood before the old wizard, alone, trembling, and couldn't go through with it. Dumbledore saw it. Snape knew it, and we all saw it too. That moment proved, once and for all, Draco wasn't made for hatred or violence. Number 7, he stopped Crabbe from using an unforgivable curse. In the Room of Requirement, Draco didn't act like a Death Eater. He became a restraining force. When Crabbe tried to use an unforgivable curse on Harry and Hermione, Draco stopped him. Formally, it was because Voldemort wanted Potter alive, but deep down it was because Draco didn't want his former classmates to die. Number 8. He defied his parents for love. In The Cursed Child, we learn that Draco married Astoria Greengrass, a kind-hearted girl with views far from the pure blood fanaticism of the Malfoy legacy. His parents disapproved of the union, but he stayed with her. He chose not only love, but a path different from that of his ancestors. It was a step toward freedom and inner healing. Number 9. Lucius tried to protect Draco from Voldemort's wrath. Lucius Malfoy had always walked with pride, his cane tapping like a warning through the halls of power. But when Voldemort gave Draco the task of killing Dumbledore, everything changed. Lucius, locked in Azkaban after the fiasco at the Department of Mysteries, could only watch as his son was pulled into the darkest part of the war. He knew what the mission truly was, a death sentence. Desperate, he sent secret messages through loyal contacts, pleading for help. It wasn't to restore honor or gain favor, it was to save Draco. For once, the scheming stopped. The father spoke louder than the Death Eater. He had no wand, no freedom, no control. But Lucius tried. That mattered. The cold aristocrat who once sneered at blood traitors now feared for his only child. In Half-Blood Prince, Draco appears thinner, pale, and tense, carrying the weight of impossible expectations. Lucius saw it coming. And though the books do not show him taking direct action on the page, the consequences of his concern ripple through the story. Behind the silence of Azkaban walls was a man praying his son would survive the legacy he had passed down. Number 10. Narcissa helped Snape keep Draco alive. The fire at Spinner's End cast shadows on Narcissa Malfoy's face as she stood before Severus Snape. Her voice was shaking, but her eyes were fierce. "You will look after him as though he were your own son," she said. And then she did something unthinkable. She dropped to her knees and begged. Bellatrix screamed it was madness. But Narcissa pressed Snape to make the unbreakable vow, a magical promise that, if broken, would cost him his life. "Will you, Severus?" she whispered. And he answered, "I will." The vow was sealed in silence and fire. This was no small request. Narcissa knew what she was doing. She wasn't just pleading for help. She was binding Snape to protect Draco no matter the cost. Her son had been tasked by Voldemort to kill Albus Dumbledore, a mission designed to punish the Malfoys. Narcissa saw the trap and acted. In that moment, she wasn't a follower of Voldemort or a Malfoy. She was a mother, a desperate one, and Snape, though cold and calculating, agreed, because even he understood the power of love that fights death itself. Number 11. Draco returned Harry's wand after the Battle of Hogwarts. The dust hadn't yet settled after the Battle of Hogwarts. The walls were scorched, and silence hung heavy where once there was chaos. Amid the rubble, Draco Malfoy approached Harry Potter, not with arrogance, not with a sneer, but with something rare for a Malfoy: humility. In his hand was a wand, not his own, Harry's, the one Draco had taken from him back in Malfoy Manor. Without a word, he held it out. Harry took it. Their eyes met. No anger, no blame. Just an unspoken understanding that something between them had changed. It was a small gesture, almost forgettable in the grand scale of war, but in that moment it meant everything. The wand had once been a symbol of defeat, Harry's defeat. Now it was a symbol of respect, of peace. Draco could have kept it. He could have said nothing, disappeared into the crowd, and clung to what little pride he had left. Instead, he gave it back. No demands, no excuses, just a quiet, deliberate act of closure. This moment isn't described in exact detail in the books, but it lives in the space between the lines. In the Deathly Hallows, we learn that Draco disarmed Dumbledore, and later that Harry took Draco's wand. That connection between them through the shifting ownership of power comes full circle. By returning the wand, Draco acknowledged the truth. Harry had earned it. Not just the wand, but the victory, the respect, the right to lead the new world. Number 12. Lucius and Narcissa raised Scorpius with different values. Scorpius Malfoy was not like the Malfoys that came before him. He smiled easily. He made friends without asking about blood status. He laughed with Albus Potter on the Hogwarts Express, even knowing the whispers that followed his name. Behind that warmth was a quiet truth. Lucius and Narcissa Malfoy had changed. They no longer raised children with fear and superiority. They watched their grandson grow and, for once, didn't try to mold him into a weapon of legacy. They let Draco raise him differently, and they didn't interfere. Lucius Malfoy, the man who once told the Minister of Magic that Muggleborns had no place in Hogwarts, now stood silently as Scorpius read books about magical history written by half-blood scholars. He no longer snapped, no lectures, just long, thoughtful pauses. Narcissa, once so obsessed with the family name, helped Scorpius with his herbology homework and listened, really listened, when he talked about Albus. "He's my best friend," Scorpius would say. Narcissa would nod. The silence between her and Lucius held years of regret. In The Cursed Child, Scorpius becomes one of the kindest students in Hogwarts. He's known for his intelligence and his gentle nature. Even when other students mock him with rumours, calling him the son of Voldemort, he never retaliates with cruelty. He just walks on, shoulders straight, heart intact. That strength didn't come from fear, it came from love, from a home that finally was no longer built on dominance but on understanding. Lucius and Narcissa never said the words aloud, but they watched, they softened, they learned. This wasn't redemption in speeches or headlines, it was redemption through a child, a Malfoy who chose friendship over pride, who chose kindness over status. And behind him stood two aging figures who had seen what hatred could destroy and decided never to pass it on again. Number 13, Draco admitted his family's mistakes and reconciled with Harry and Ron. Draco Malfoy once stood sneering at Harry Potter from the steps of the Hogwarts Express. Years later, he stood beside him as an equal. In The Cursed Child, Draco did something no one expected. He reached out. He acknowledged the damage his family had done. He admitted that hate had shaped his childhood and that fear had ruled their choices. He told Harry, "I used to envy you, your friendship, your ability to find light, even in the dark." The boy who once mocked Ron's robes and Hermione's bloodline had learned humility. And more than that, he had learned regret. It was never easy. The past still lived between them like a ghost, but Draco didn't let it stop him. When their sons, Scorpius and Albus, became friends, Draco chose to support them instead of pulling them apart. He defended the bond that once would have made his younger self sick with prideful rage. "We have to trust our sons," he told Harry. "It's their world, not ours." These words didn't come from the spoiled Slytherin child. They came from a father who had seen war, loss, and what hatred could do. Ron Weasley never forgot the past, but even he changed. In a rare moment of humour, Ron joked to Draco, "You're not the absolute worst anymore." It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a start. They no longer drew wands at the sight of each other. They exchanged nods, sometimes words, sometimes even agreement. The ice had cracked, and Draco had been the one to strike first. Number 14, Narcissa secretly supported Andromeda after the war. The war had ended. The Dark Lord was gone. But silence fell like a veil over the ruins he'd left behind. Somewhere, in a modest cottage far from the grandeur of Malfoy Manor, Andromeda Tonks sat alone. Her daughter, Nymphadora, had died on the battlefield. Her husband, Ted, had been murdered while on the run. All she had left was a baby, little Teddy Lupin. And unknown to most, help came not from the ministry, not from friends, but from her estranged sister, Narcissa Malfoy. The sisters hadn't spoken in years. Andromeda had been cast out for marrying Ted Tonks, a Muggle-born wizard. Bellatrix, their other sister, had called her a blood traitor. Narcissa hadn't spoken against the decision, but after the war she did something unthinkable for a Malfoy. She wrote. The letter came unsigned, in neat, slanted handwriting. It offered condolences. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It simply said, "You are not alone." Enclosed was a small pouch of galleons, enough to last a month. And it kept coming. Quiet envelopes, no return address. Just a flicker of sisterhood through ink and parchment. There is no mention of this in the books, but even Rowling hinted that Narcissa's motivations were always guided by love, not ideology. She had defied Voldemort to protect Draco. Could she not also defy her family's pride to reach out to her grieving sister? She was no Death Eater, Rowling once said in an interview, just a mother. But perhaps she was also still a sister. One who watched the world burn and couldn't let her last blood relative face the ashes alone. Narcissa never asked for praise. She never revealed the truth, even to Draco. The Malfoy name had been stained, but this one act remained hidden, like a clean thread in a torn tapestry. Number 15. Lucius tried to stop Bellatrix at Malfoy Manor. Lucius Malfoy stood by the grand fireplace of Malfoy Manor, his wand loose in his hand, his face pale. Bellatrix Lestrange's shrill voice echoed off the cold stone walls as she pressed her blade deeper into Hermione Granger's arm, carving a word that dripped blood and cruelty. Mudblood. But if anyone had looked closely, they would have seen it. The twitch in Lucius's jaw, the way his hand trembled, how his eyes flickered not with triumph, but with unease. He didn't scream or lunge. He couldn't. Not with Voldemort's shadow looming over his home, not with the other Death Eaters watching. But Lucius spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper, trying to regain control. "Bella, that's enough," he said once, low and quick. She didn't listen. She never did. Still he tried again, shifting uncomfortably, exchanging looks with Narcissa, who clutched Draco's hand with white knuckles. It was fear, yes, but it was also shame. J.K. Rowling never told us Lucius changed completely, but she let the cracks show. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Chapter 23, as Bellatrix screamed and Hermione sobbed, Lucius was pacing the room nervously, barely able to meet anyone's eyes. He wasn't a hero. He didn't fight for Hermione, but he wasn't blind either. This was no longer the world he wanted to be part of. He had dreamed of power. What he saw instead was madness and a girl's pain. His silence didn't redeem him, but it told us something. There was a line even Lucius wouldn't cross. Perhaps it was his son standing frozen near the doorway. Perhaps it was his wife's quiet horror. Or perhaps it was the bitter taste of defeat, knowing Voldemort didn't see him as an equal, only a pawn. In that moment, Lucius didn't raise his wand. Number 16. Draco regretted Crabbe's death despite his betrayal. In the dim firelit corridors of Hogwarts, while spells echoed through shattered halls and rubble spilled like blood from open wounds, a tragedy unfolded far from the main battle. It did not take place on the ramparts or in the Forbidden Forest, but in the heart of the Room of Requirement, a place known for changing shape to serve the needs of those who entered. On that final night, the room transformed into a vast warehouse of hidden secrets, hoarded objects, and forgotten ambitions. It also became the site of one of the most senseless deaths of the war. Vincent Crabbe, once nothing more than a brutish shadow at Draco Malfoy's side, turned violently on his companions. In a foolish display of misguided allegiance, he unleashed fiend fire, the cursed fire that feeds on everything, even its creator. The moment was sudden and catastrophic. Draco, along with Gregory Goyle and Blaise Zabini, had accompanied Harry, Ron, and Hermione into the chamber, all searching for the lost diadem of Ravenclaw. But Crabbe, inflamed by dark ideology and perhaps a desperate need to prove his worth, chose betrayal over loyalty. In a voice trembling with fanatic fervor, he shouted, "Avada Kedavra!" and moments later unleashed the cursed flames. It was not just an act of madness, it was a death sentence for everyone present. Crabbe's body was consumed in an instant, swallowed by the fire he failed to control. The inferno roared like a living beast, its tongues forming shapes of monstrous serpents and dragons, reducing ancient relics and stone columns to ash. The only reason Draco survived was because Harry, Ron, and Hermione risked their lives to rescue him and Goyle. For most, the memory of Crabbe ends there, a tragic casualty of his own recklessness. But for Draco Malfoy, the story did not end with flames. In the aftermath of the war, as the wizarding world tried to stitch itself back together, Draco was not quick to speak about what had happened that night. Yet those close to him noticed a shift, not only in his manner, which had always been cold and proud, but in his silences. In the weeks that followed the battle, he would often fall quiet when asked about the Room of Requirement. "I should have stopped him," he once muttered to his mother Narcissa, according to house elf testimony later revealed in the Malfoy family interviews. He wasn't like that when we were younger. There was something childlike about those words, the regret of someone who had lost a friend and failed to notice when that friend had started to change. Crabbe had been with Draco since their very first ride on the Hogwarts Express. They had sat together in the Slytherin common room, cheered at Quidditch matches, and patrolled the castle during the Carrow's reign of terror. But it wasn't until it was too late that Draco realized how far gone Crabbe truly was. Even in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, there are clues that Draco was no longer proud of his companion's choices. When Crabbe begins to shout and curse during the chase through the Room of Requirement, Draco pleads, "Don't kill him, don't kill him!" A strange and trembling command in the chaos of war. Those words weren't aimed at Harry, they were for Crabbe, desperate and too far lost. Draco wasn't trying to protect Harry at that moment, he was trying to stop a disaster. It's easy to dismiss Draco's sorrow as guilt born of survival. But deeper conversations between Draco and his mother, shared only with close family confidants, paint a more tragic picture. "Vincent was never meant to be a soldier," he once said. "He was a follower, and I made myself a leader too young." Draco knew that Crabbe lacked the cleverness to make his own path. He had simply followed Draco's lead for 6 years. And when Draco began to fall apart in 6th year, caught between Dumbledore and Voldemort, Crabbe began looking for someone else to follow. He found that path in hatred. There is no denying Crabbe's actions were unforgivable. Fiend fire is a weapon of dark magic so dangerous it's classified as a forbidden curse. But the boy who unleashed it wasn't always a monster. He had once laughed at jokes, stumbled through potions class, and carved initials into the old Slytherin tables. And Draco, perhaps the only one who truly knew the difference, carried that ghost with him. Blaise Zabini once recounted in a rare interview given to the Daily Prophet's post-war memoir series that Draco had refused to speak Crabbe's name for months after the battle. "It was like something haunted him," Blaise said. "He'd flinch if you even brought up that room. And once I caught him looking through old photos. First-year stuff, back when we didn't know anything about war. He just sat there staring." What Draco regretted most was not that Crabbe had died. It was that he had let Crabbe grow into someone capable of murder without ever stepping in. "I should have seen it coming," he said, in a private letter found in the Malfoy family archives, later donated to the Hogwarts Historical Society. "He hated so blindly, and I let it become normal." There's a subtle but significant moment during the epilogue of Deathly Hallows where Draco sees Harry and nods silently at him on the platform at King's Cross. Though words are not exchanged, it is a powerful scene, and it reflects something that happened years before, the act of being saved by the very people he was taught to hate. One can't help but wonder whether part of Draco's gaze isn't also haunted by the memory of someone who wasn't saved. Number 17. The Malfoy family gave up dark artifacts after the war. Of all the surprises that followed the Second Wizarding War, few caused as much whispered speculation in the corridors of the Ministry or among the pages of the Daily Prophet as the public gesture made by the Malfoy family. Within mere weeks after Lord Voldemort had fallen, his body crumpled in the dust of the Great Hall, his soul finally scattered into the void. It was reported that Lucius Malfoy had requested a private audience with the Minister of Magic. Many assumed it was to plea bargain, to salvage what remained of his dwindling political influence. But what transpired was far more astonishing. The Malfoys, once proud keepers of a long and sinister legacy, chose to renounce it, not in vague statements or carefully worded public apologies, but in a striking act of submission. They turned over their vast collection of dark artifacts, items amassed over generations of blood purity fanaticism, objects soaked in forbidden enchantments and twisted magic. A century-old tradition of hoarding power in shadowed cabinets and secret chambers was suddenly severed, as if the fall of the Dark Lord had also shattered something internal in the marble halls of Malfoy Manor. When Aurors first entered the estate under official warrant, it wasn't to raid or ransack. They were invited. Narcissa Malfoy, with her usual poise, had personally unlocked the doors to the eastern wing, a section long rumoured to house grim relics that even the most seasoned curse-breakers approached with caution. Among the collection were cursed opal necklaces, mirrors that whispered lies until their owners went mad, blood-stained books bound in dragon hide, and even a shrunken box of inferi fingers still twitching as if seeking out warmth. "These are no longer part of our future," she reportedly said, placing the iron key into the palm of Aura Savage. What compelled this change? Some say it was fear. After all, the Malfoys had seen their son, Draco, forced into the ranks of the Death Eaters, pressed into service under a master who viewed loyalty as disposability. They had been close enough to feel the full burn of Voldemort's displeasure. Others suggest it was shame, Narcissa's quiet defiance in the Forbidden Forest when she lied to the Dark Lord to save her son may have been the first crack in a wall built over generations. Still others believe it was survival, plain and simple. In post-war Britain, there was no place for those who clung to the old ways. But what made this surrender of artifacts so compelling was not just the gesture, but the manner in which it was done. Lucius Malfoy did not attempt to bargain for leniency. He asked for no immunity. He made no press statements. The items were handed over without ceremony. "It is time," was all he reportedly said when confronted by Minister Kingsley Shacklebolt. And perhaps that simple sentence carried more weight than 1,000 press releases. One of the most infamous items surrendered was the Mirror of Astigen, a cruel twin to the Mirror of Erased, but instead of revealing one's deepest desire, it showed the viewer what they most feared becoming. Many witches and wizards lost their minds peering into its depths, unable to distinguish reflection from reality. The mirror had been in the Malfoy family since 1784, a wedding gift from the Knott family. Lucius himself had once boasted about using it to instill fear in disobedient house elves. Now, wrapped in cursed resistant cloth, it was placed into a ministry vault, never to be used again. Draco Malfoy's role in this quiet revolution cannot be overstated. Barely 18 at the time, and reeling from the chaos of the war, he nevertheless stood beside his parents as they made their declaration. It was Draco who, according to records, led the team of ministry agents through the manor, pointing out which walls concealed hidden passageways, which floorboards creaked over trapdoors, hiding cursed tomes. "I'm not proud," he reportedly told Aura Williamson, "but I want to be free." Years later, Hermione Granger, then deputy head of magical law enforcement, would remark on the significance of the moment. The Malfoys could have chosen silence, they could have claimed ignorance, but instead they gave us something precious, the truth. They exposed their own darkness in a way few others dared. She would later spearhead a reform bill known as the Artifact Amnesty Act, encouraging others to follow suit, though few did. Among the items uncovered was a particularly dangerous object known as the Singing Jar of Belladonna Black, a sentient container that would sing lullabies in Parseltongue, slowly driving any non-Slytherin to madness. It had been displayed astonishingly in the family's drawing room for decades. The jar was so powerful that it took 5 unspeakables to subdue it for transport. Its presence in the Malfoy household was a reminder of how deeply intertwined the family had become with the grotesque beauty of the dark arts. And yet, not all members of the wizarding world welcomed the Malfoys' redemption. In Nocturne Alley, whispers grew that the family had only surrendered the lesser artifacts, keeping the most powerful for themselves. Some believed that Lucius had simply hidden the worst items in Gringotts' vaults, or passed them to foreign associates. "A leopard doesn't change its spots," sneered Mundungus Fletcher in one interview, though his credibility was, as usual, questionable. However, there was one undeniable fact. The aura around Malfoy Manor changed. Once a place of whispers and dread, it became strangely quiet. Children no longer crossed the street in fear when walking past its gates. The peacocks on the lawn seemed less menacing. And for the first time in memory, Narcissa was seen attending a public charity event for war orphans, standing beside Andromeda Tonks, her estranged sister. Number 18. Draco openly supported Scorpius and Albus Potter's friendship. The moment Draco Malfoy stood up and defended his son's friendship with Albus Potter, something in the magical world shifted. It wasn't just a private choice made behind closed doors, but a public, unapologetic rejection of a legacy built on blood status, prejudice, and cold ambition. For those who remembered the Draco of Hogwarts, the sharp-tongued, sneering boy who mocked Harry, Ron, and Hermione at every turn, this new Draco was almost unrecognizable, and yet perhaps it was this very transformation that made his actions all the more powerful. In Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, Draco doesn't merely tolerate his son's closeness to Albus. He supports it, openly, fiercely, even painfully. From the beginning, it was clear that the friendship between Scorpius Malfoy and Albus Severus Potter raised eyebrows. Their connection was strange to many. The son of Harry Potter, the boy who lived, best friends with the son of a former Death Eater. For those stuck in the past, it felt unnatural, if not downright threatening. And when the cruel rumours began, whispers that Scorpius was not actually Draco's son, but the product of a time-turner scheme involving Lord Voldemort and Hermione Granger, the Malfoy name was dragged once more into the shadows. These whispers cut deep and they spread fast, but Draco did not shrink from them. He stood tall, not just for his son, but for the truth. "Scorpius is my son," he said, his voice firm, his posture unwavering, "and I love him more than anything on this earth." It was a declaration few expected and fewer could argue with. There was a particular moment, quiet but unforgettable, in which Draco faced down a group of sneering pure-blood parents at a ministry event. One of them, a pompous man from the Travers family, made a snide remark about the company young Malfoy keeps. Draco didn't raise his voice. He didn't cast a hex. He simply said, "I would rather my son befriend a Potter than grow up as lonely and bitter as we once were." The silence that followed was more potent than any spell. Draco's support wasn't just verbal. He took visible steps to include Albus Potter in family events, even when Astoria was gone and the grief in their home was still thick in the air. When Scorpius invited Albus to Malfoy Manor, it was Draco who greeted him at the door, no house elf in sight, no haughty expression on his face. He treated the boy with respect, not because Albus was Harry's son, but because he was Scorpius's friend. "You're always welcome here," he told him. "Scorpius needs you." What made this shift in Draco so striking was how consistent and sincere it felt. This wasn't a man pretending for show. He had grown, he had suffered, he had buried his wife, seen the worst of his past, and chosen to let it die with her. Astoria had taught him compassion. Scorpius had taught him humility. The Draco of 20 years ago wouldn't have recognized the man he'd become, but perhaps he would have admired him secretly, longed to be him. Draco's own admission to Harry was one of the play's most intimate and telling scenes. In a rare moment of vulnerability, he said, "My son, the thing I never had, his best friend, you have no idea how much I wanted that for him. People didn't like me, I didn't have friends, not real ones, and I didn't want that for him." It was a quiet confession, delivered without pride, but full of fatherly desperation. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, he was simply telling the truth. The irony, of course, was that Draco had once done everything in his power to make Harry's school life miserable, and yet here he was, urging their sons to keep close. He knew better than most what isolation could do to a child, how it twisted the soul, turned pride into armor, and made cruelty seem like strength. By letting go of his pride, Draco did something no spell could ever accomplish. He broke a generational curse. When Albus and Scorpius disappeared into time, risking everything to save Cedric Diggory, and unintentionally altering the timeline, Draco didn't blame Harry or Albus. Instead, he focused on finding the boys. He teamed up with Harry, even when it hurt. He fought to use the last remaining time turner, risking punishment, ridicule, and more trauma just to bring them home. His priorities were painfully clear. Family first, always. The public perception of Draco began to change. Slowly at first, a few wizarding newspapers ran sympathetic stories about his devotion as a father. The Daily Prophet published a column titled "From Death Eater to Devoted Dad, The Redemption of Draco Malfoy." It was a sensational title, but the story rang true. Even skeptics had to admit it. The man had changed. Some purebloods grumbled that he was weak. Others whispered that Astoria had softened him too much. But the truth was, Draco had made a choice. He chose love over legacy. Scorpius, of course, felt the weight of his father's defense every day. He told Albus once, after a particularly difficult term, "He doesn't say it often, but I know. He's proud of me. Even with all the rumors, maybe especially because of them." And indeed, every time Scorpius was mocked or questioned, Draco didn't shield him with silence. He gave him strength by standing beside him, never in front. Harry Potter himself admitted, grudgingly but honestly, that Draco's parenting surprised him. "He's a better father than I ever imagined," Harry once told Ginny. "Maybe even a better one than I am sometimes." Ginny, ever perceptive, nodded. That's what grief does. It either hardens you or opens you up. Draco chose to be open. Number 19. Narcissa helped hide evidence that could hurt Snape. The battle was over, but Hogwarts still bore the scars of war. Rubble littered the corridors, portraits hung askew, and the air carried the heavy scent of ash and silence. In the aftermath of Voldemort's fall, a strange kind of justice swept through the wizarding world, furious, chaotic, and hungry for retribution. The dead were honored, the traitors were named. And yet, in the shadows of the Great Hall, where the final duel had ended, another name lingered in uncertain judgment: Severus Snape. To many, Snape was a murderer, the man who killed Albus Dumbledore, the trusted headmaster. Even as Potter publicly revealed Snape's true allegiance, whispers never quite died down. How do we know Potter didn't lie? Some asked in the alleys of Nocturne. Wasn't Snape a Death Eater first? Others murmured over copies of the Daily Prophet. Even Kingsley Shacklebolt, newly appointed Minister for Magic, struggled to calm the rising tide of doubt. The truth was written nowhere official. Snape's pensive memories, shown to a handful, weren't widely shared. And that was the moment Narcissa Malfoy made her quiet choice. Few knew the full extent of what she did in the days following the battle. While Lucius sat in their Wiltshire manor, numb and broken, and Draco walked in circles through the same 4 corridors of their ancestral home, Narcissa acted. She had seen the shift in the world, the same world that once fawned over pureblood elegance, now looked at the Malfoys with suspicion and contempt. Yet Narcissa cared little for appearances in that moment. Her mind was consumed by a man she had once hated, a man she had feared, Severus Snape. It began when she found the letter. The owl had arrived late, long after the victory celebrations had died down. Delivered by an unfamiliar barn owl, it bore no seal, only her name in Slughorn's looping hand. The letter was brief and cryptic. You might wish to collect what remains in Spinner's End. Others will be searching soon. Narcissa read it once, then again, before summoning her cloak. She told no one, not even Draco. Within the hour, she apparated to Cokeworth. Spinner's End had not changed since the war. Narrow, wet streets shimmered with grime. Snape's home stood silently between sagging brick buildings, its windows blind and shuttered. She entered with ease. The wards had either broken upon his death or recognized her magic. Inside, she found what she feared and expected: letters, journals, bottled memories sealed in dusty flasks, reports addressed to Dumbledore, notes in the margins of potions textbooks, plans scrawled in messy ink, half-erased incantations she could barely decipher. One folder, thick and worn, bore the Ministry's crest. A spy report, Snape's own record of Death Eater movements, coded and annotated. Narcissa traced the writing with her gloved fingers. There, under the date of August 1996, a note: Narcissa Malfoy visited, requested vow of loyalty for her son. And another, fulfilled unbreakable vow, bound to protect Draco. She stared at the words, her throat tight. This, she realized, would be enough to confirm Snape's loyalty. And yet, in the wrong hands, could also be twisted. The Ministry was not yet merciful. Auras had already arrested Dolohov's family. Bellatrix was dead, but others in her bloodline had been taken into custody for less than what this report implied. If they found this, if they knew the vow had happened in Snape's house, they might use it to discredit him. Worse, they might turn on her, twist her act of maternal desperation into another tool for prosecution. She burned that folder first. With one wave of her wand and a muttered incendio, the parchment turned to ash. A wisp of smoke rose like a ghost toward the ceiling, then disappeared. Narcissa did not flinch. She burned the letters next, those written in Snape's hand to Dumbledore, revealing his position as double agent. Some she could not bear to destroy. A few she tucked into her robes, planning to bury them far from Wiltshire, where even the Malfoy name held no power. The memory vials came last. She lined them on the floor, each labelled in Latin or shorthand. Night with Albus, vow taken, meeting at Malfoy Manor, arrival of Greyback. She knew what they contained without looking. If any aura found these, Snape's actions could be publicly twisted. He had attended meetings at the Manor, true. He had sat beside Voldemort. Narcissa understood how thin the line was between justice and vengeance. It was the same line her family had walked since the day Draco received the dark mark. She smashed the vials one by one. Only one she kept intact, labelled simply, Lily. It was the smallest bottle, cloudy and trembling, as though the contents remembered pain. She tucked it deep into her cloak's lining. Narcissa had never known Lily Potter, but she knew what that name meant to Severus. That memory, she felt, did not belong to the ministry. It was not for trial or history. It was sacred, private, human. In the days that followed, she returned twice more. Once to retrieve a hidden drawer in Snape's desk, where she found a silver locket wrapped in dragon hide. Inside was a single sentence engraved with magic, for the child who sees both sides. She would later give it to Harry Potter, quietly, with no explanation. Potter never asked questions. He only looked at her, nodded once, and slipped the locket into his pocket. Perhaps he too understood. The second time she came, she brought Draco. He did not understand at first. "Why are we here?" he whispered, staring at the broken shelves, the cracked window, the scattered ashes of burnt parchment. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Because Severus deserves better," she said. Draco stood in silence, watching his mother gather the remaining objects, a few books, an old photograph of Hogwarts, a vial of wolfsbane potion Snape had brewed for Lupin years ago. Narcissa placed them gently into a satchel. "We owe him this," she added. Perhaps the most telling moment came weeks later, when the Wizengamot summoned the Malfoys for testimony. Narcissa stood before the court in pale grey, her chin held high. They asked her, under veritaserum, whether she had witnessed Severus Snape murder Dumbledore. Her answer was measured, calm. "No, I was not there." They asked if she had knowledge of Snape's loyalties. "I believe," she said slowly, "that Severus Snape acted to protect my son. I believe he was working under the instructions of Albus Dumbledore, though I cannot claim to know all their secrets." The court pushed harder. "Did you aid Severus Snape in any way after the war?" "I did not," she answered, and under veritaserum the words were true. Snape was already dead. There was no way to help him in life anymore. What she had done was not for him, not exactly. It was for his memory, for truth, for something like justice. Years passed. The world moved on. New generations entered Hogwarts. The war faded into textbooks and bedtime stories, but every so often a visitor to the rebuilt library would stumble upon a rare, unmarked potions manual in the restricted section, annotated in two hands, one sharp, the other delicate. Or a professor would mention Snape's name not with disdain, but with quiet respect. And once, only once, Harry Potter told his own son, "There was a woman who lied to the Dark Lord to save me." Not for me, but for her son. Her name was Narcissa. She also saved a man the world hated when no one else would. The boy blinked, confused. "But wasn't she a Malfoy?" Harry smiled. "Yes. But sometimes the bravest things are done by those we least expect." In Spinner's End, the house eventually collapsed from neglect. Rain crept through the broken roof. Bricks fell into the river. But in a field near Wiltshire, where no maps marked the spot, a box lay buried. Inside were fragments of a life erased from history, quills, sealed letters, a memory vial, a potions pin bearing the Slytherin crest, and a note in Narcissa's handwriting. "For what you did not ask to be remembered." She never told anyone what else she had saved, but every year, on the day of Snape's death, she spent 1 hour alone in her garden, beneath a weeping willow, with a cup of black tea. Not mourning, not grieving, remembering. And perhaps that was the most human act of all. Number 20. Lucius donated a family heirloom to reconcile with the ministry. Of all the sacrifices Lucius Malfoy ever made in his life, none was more bitter, more humiliating, or more deeply symbolic than surrendering the ancient wand of Armando, the sacred relic of House Malfoy, passed down for over 7 centuries. It was not just a wand, it was a totem, an heirloom older than the manor itself, crafted from white yew and bound with a single hair, from a thestral of royal lineage, enchanted to channel not just magic, but legacy. And yet in the grey winter of 1999, Lucius carried it to the Ministry of Magic in a velvet-lined box and gave it away. It had been months since the fall of Voldemort. The dust had barely settled over the battlefield of Hogwarts, but the war's echoes had reached deep into the Ministry's cold, echoing chambers. There, in the shadow of suspicion and public outrage, a long list of names was read aloud, one by one. Lucius Malfoy's name was etched near the top, his crimes more symbolic than bloody, his guilt undeniable but bureaucratically negotiable. The Ministry, seeking to rebuild a fractured wizarding society, launched the Reconciliation Initiative, an unprecedented program aimed at healing through selective leniency. But leniency came with a price. The Malfoy estate faced severe scrutiny. Officials from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement walked the halls of Malfoy Manor, taking inventory. "They're measuring the wallpaper," Draco whispered bitterly one evening, "looking for secrets in the ink of the library books." Narcissa said nothing, staring into her teacup, but Lucius stood before the fireplace, jaw clenched, thinking about the wand of Armando. For days he had said nothing. But the whispers in the Ministry grew louder, rumours of asset seizures, rumours of arrest. And then Lucius made a decision that shocked even his wife. "I will give them the wand," he said one night, his voice hoarse as though he had aged a decade. "Armando's wand." Narcissa rose sharply from her seat. "No," she whispered. "Lucius, that wand is older than this house. You swore you'd never part with it." Lucius turned to her, eyes hollow. "I also swore our family would never wear prison robes." The following morning he dressed with slow precision. Black robes with silver lining, a cravat fastened with the crest of his house. He moved like a man heading to the gallows. In the box he carried, the wand seemed to hum faintly, reluctant to leave the hands of its bloodline. It had once belonged to Armando Malfoy, a 13th century warlock who had famously cursed the Saxon Prince Ulrich for defiling a sacred grove. The wand had been wielded in duels, ceremonies, and at every Malfoy patriarch's funeral, but now it was to be surrendered. Percy Weasley, then the newly appointed Undersecretary to the Minister, accepted the wand with ceremonial gravity. "Mr. Malfoy, this is unexpected." Lucius merely nodded. "Let it go toward rebuilding the school. My son will not learn under a crumbling roof." Percy blinked. "You understand this will be publicized?" Lucius's voice dropped. "That is the point, Mr. Weasley. Let them see that we can bleed." The donation caused an uproar in the wizarding world. The Daily Prophet ran the headline, "Malfoy relic donated, symbol of peace or act of desperation." In Diagon Alley, whispers filled the air. Some scoffed at the gesture, calling it a calculated move to avoid Azkaban. Others, including Kingsley Shacklebolt himself, saw it differently. "It takes a particular kind of courage," he said, at a press briefing, "to give up the very symbols of your power. Mr. Malfoy has shown a desire for reconciliation." The wand was placed in the Hall of Remembrance at Hogwarts behind enchanted glass. A plaque beneath it read, "Donated by Lucius Malfoy for the restoration of Hogwarts, 1999. Students passed it on their way to charms class, unaware of the weight it carried, not just in magic, but in meaning. Professor Flitwick once paused before it, brushing dust off the glass. "That wand," he murmured, "was once considered too dangerous to be held in the public eye. And now look at it, silent as a stone." But to Lucius, the wand was never truly gone. He could feel its absence like a phantom limb. He had often admired it in the moonlight, seated alone in his study, turning it in his fingers as one might turn over a family photograph. His father, Abraxas Malfoy, had entrusted it to him at the age of 21 with the words, "This is not for combat, my son, this is for legacy." And now that legacy lay in a glass box, surrounded by tourists and school children, Draco's reaction was complicated. At first, he was furious. "You gave them our name!" he shouted. "That wand was proof we came from power!" Lucius did not raise his voice. "And now it is proof we chose peace." Draco didn't understand. Not then. But years later, when he brought his own son, Scorpius, to Hogwarts, he paused before the wand and told him the story. "My father gave that up," he said, "so I could walk free in this world." There were rumours, of course, that Lucius had placed a hidden enchantment on the wand before surrendering it, a whisper of protection, or a curse that only blood magic could unlock. But no evidence ever surfaced. When Hermione Granger, as head of the Department for Magical Artifacts, inspected the wand during a Hogwarts inspection, she found only a lingering trace of deep ancestral magic. "It's old," she told Headmistress McGonagall. "Very old, but it's calm. No tricks." Even Harry Potter, in his quiet reflections, came to see Lucius in a different light. "He was a coward," he once said to Ron, "but he did what cowards rarely do. He let go of what made him feel powerful." Ron snorted. "Yeah, must have killed him to do it." But Harry's voice was thoughtful. "Maybe that's the point." In Lucius's study at Malfoy Manor, where the wand once lay displayed in a velvet case, there is now only a bare shelf. The empty space remains untouched. Dust does not settle there. Narcissa once placed a vase of white orchids on it, but Lucius removed them. "Let it remain as it is," he told her, "so we remember." And though his home retained its grandeur, that shelf was its quiet wound. The wand of Armando had not just symbolized power, it had also been a tether to identity, to ancestry. Lucius was not merely giving up a magical artifact, he was renouncing the very ghost of supremacy that had lingered in the Malfoy bloodline for generations. In doing so, he altered the path of that name, slightly but irrevocably. Some old allies of Lucius saw it as betrayal. "You're bowing to the new regime," one wrote in a private letter. "This is not the Lucius I knew." Lucius didn't respond. He burned the letter in the fireplace, watching the parchment curl into ash. In silence, he returned to the window and looked out over the estate. For once, the gardens felt still. Not conquered, but surrendered. One summer evening, Luna Lovegood was invited to Hogwarts to speak on magical artifacts. As she stood before the wand's glass case, she tilted her head and said, "This wand is grieving. Can't you feel it? It misses its family." Her words, as always, were met with indulgent smiles. But Neville Longbottom, standing beside her, placed a hand on the glass. "Maybe," he whispered, "but maybe it's proud to." Even years later, the story of the wand lived on. It became part of Hogwarts legend, the tale of the aristocrat who gave up power for peace. First-year students would whisper about it on stormy nights, imagining the cursed power it once held. But those who knew better, who knew history, understood it not as a tale of dark magic, but of redemption. Lucius Malfoy never spoke of the wand again. Not to his son, not to his wife, not even to himself. But in his final years, he was often found sitting in the old study, gazing at the empty shelf. And when he died, no wand was placed in his tomb. Instead, Scorpius laid a single thestral hair across his chest, bound in white yew wood, a reminder of what was once held and what was willingly let go. Number 21. Draco personally apologized to Neville Longbottom. Of all the stories whispered through the ancient stone corridors of Hogwarts after the war, few stirred such quiet reverence as the one about Draco Malfoy and Neville Longbottom. It didn't make it into Rita Skeeter's flashy columns or the official ministry reports. It wasn't retold with dramatics or turned into bedtime legends like Harry's duel with Voldemort. But to those who remained in the castle in the years of rebuilding, it was one of the truest signs that change had come. It happened on a quiet spring evening, weeks after the last stone had been replaced in the crumbling astronomy tower, when the scent of new growth returned to the forbidden forest and the castle dared to exhale again. Draco had returned not as a student, but as a man carrying the weight of his name like a curse. His parents, Lucius and Narcissa, had withdrawn from public life, their influence shattered. Draco himself had avoided the spotlight, opting instead for solitude and silence. He was seen often near the greenhouses, walking with his head down, as if searching for something he had buried years before. It was there, among the scent of damp earth and blooming dittany, that he saw Neville Longbottom once more. Not the chubby boy he used to mock, but the man who stood tall against the Carrows, who drew Gryffindor's sword from the sorting hat, and who, with a single swing, severed the head of Voldemort's final Horcrux. They had barely exchanged words in the years after the war. Neville, now Professor Longbottom, had chosen to stay at Hogwarts to restore the herbology curriculum. He was a quiet presence, deeply respected, a stark contrast to the brash, defensive boy he once was. But the old memories had not vanished. There were days when students whispered that Professor Longbottom could be seen staring out toward the lake, as if remembering something too heavy to carry indoors. On that day, Draco stood hesitantly at the edge of the greenhouse, watching Neville tend to a group of venomous tentacula. His footsteps crunched softly on the gravel path, and though he had rehearsed this conversation 100 times, his voice still cracked when he said, "Longbottom." Neville didn't look up at first. The sound of the wind rustled through the glass panes, and for a moment Draco feared he wouldn't respond at all. But then calmly, Neville rose, wiped his hands on his robes, and turned to face the man who once laughed when he cried. "I thought you might come," Neville said quietly. His voice held neither warmth nor malice, only the kind of weight one gains from surviving too much too young. "I've been waiting, actually." Draco looked down. The ground beneath him felt far more solid than the years that separated them. "I came to say I'm sorry," he said. "Not because I was told to, not because it's polite, but because I've had to live with who I was. And you were always braver than I gave you credit for." Neville's expression didn't change. He waited, his eyes fixed on Draco, not with suspicion, but curiosity. Draco continued, the words tumbling out of him like stones from a broken wall. "I called you names. I laughed when others hurt you. I mocked your parents. I tried to make you small because I thought it would make me big. And I've been trying to figure out what kind of person does that, what kind of person I was." Silence filled the space between them. It was not awkward. It was sacred. Neville took a slow breath and finally asked, "Do you remember 4th year? When you tripped me outside the library and my remembrall smashed?" Draco nodded. "I do. I remember a lot more than I'd like to." "You said I'd forget my own name if it weren't for that ball," Neville said, his voice calm but steady. and that my parents were as mad as the Hagrid's hippogriff. I cried in the bathroom that day. I never told anyone, just cried. Draco closed his eyes. I'm sorry. You should be. And then something happened that Draco hadn't expected. Neville's shoulders, so tense, dropped just a little. But I forgive you, he said, because I've had to forgive worse, and because I know what it's like to carry someone else's expectations and mistake cruelty for strength. Draco looked up then, surprised. Neville gave a half smile. You're not the only one who grew up. It was not the kind of forgiveness that came with a hug or a handshake. There was no dramatic embrace, no tearful reconciliation. But there was understanding, and that was more powerful. Draco stepped forward, extended his hand, and for the first time since they were 11 years old, Neville took it. What few people knew was that Professor Sprout had witnessed the whole exchange from the shadow of a nearby trellis. She later told Minerva McGonagall that it was the most grown-up thing I'd seen in years. The headmistress, in turn, added it to a quiet logbook of redemption she kept in her office, tucked between a stack of letters and a photograph of Dumbledore smiling at a phoenix. This moment, though never penned by J.K. Rowling, fits seamlessly with the characters we know. It's easy to forget, but Draco was not a Death Eater by choice. As Rowling herself once said in an interview, Draco was a product of his upbringing. He had choices, yes, but fewer than others. He was afraid. That fear, masked by arrogance and cruelty, hurt many, Neville most of all. And yet war has a strange way of revealing the truth in people. While Harry, Ron, and Hermione were destroying Horcruxes, Draco was facing a reckoning of his own. The boy who once declared, "My father will hear about this," stood trembling in the room of requirement as flames raged around him, reaching out not for power, but for survival. When Neville later told the story to his students, he never spoke with bitterness. Draco Malfoy, he said once during a 7th-year seminar, taught me something important, that people aren't frozen in time, that who we are at 16 doesn't have to define who we are at 30 or even at 17. A student once asked, "Did he cry?" Neville laughed. "No, but I think he wanted to." One particularly revealing detail came from Madame Pince, the aging librarian, who had always been more interested in dust than drama. She claimed to have seen Draco return later that week, slipping something onto the shelves of the restricted section. "It was a book," she whispered, "a rare one, not cursed, not hexed, just a book about magical plants with a note inside that said, 'For the one who made things grow.'" No signature. But everyone knew whose hand it was. It's often the small gestures, the unseen ones, that mark true transformation. Draco didn't become a hero. He didn't join the Auras or marry a Muggleborn, but he chose to change. And that choice, made in silence, was more revolutionary than any spell. Neville, for his part, never forgot the apology. It became a quiet benchmark for him when dealing with troubled students. "People can surprise you," he would say, when a Slytherin boy acted out or when a student failed their OWLs, even the ones you least expect. Years later, at the christening of Neville's first child, Draco was seen among the guests. He stood quietly near the back beside Luna Lovegood, who handed him a daisy and whispered, "This suits you more than a snake ever did." He didn't argue. There were rumours that the two exchanged letters after that. Short ones. Honest ones. In one of them, preserved by the Longbottom family archives, Draco wrote, "The hardest part of changing is knowing when to begin. You gave me that moment. Thank you." And so, while the tales of the boy who lived and the defeat of the Dark Lord remain the loudest echoes of that era, There are quieter truths like the one told in the greenhouse, a story of courage, not in battle, but in humility, of redemption, not in glory, but in apology. It is a reminder that some of the most powerful magic lies not in wands, but in words. And sometimes all it takes to break an old curse is to say, "I'm sorry." Number 22. The Malfoys helped heal the wounded after the battle. The Battle of Hogwarts had left its mark, not only in the shattered walls of the ancient castle, but in the hearts of every witch and wizard who had survived it. Fires had been extinguished, bodies buried, but the real healing had only just begun. Among the cries for help and the quiet hum of spells being cast to knit flesh and mend bone, a name began to surface again and again: Malfoy. At first whispered with disbelief, later spoken aloud with cautious gratitude. The idea that the Malfoy family, once so closely aligned with Voldemort, it would offer aid to the injured, seemed preposterous. Just months before, Narcissa Malfoy had stood cold and elegant at the Dark Lord's side, Lucius, a broken man clinging to old power, and Draco, pale and trembling, walking a tightrope between fear and duty. But something had shifted after that final night. It was Madame Pomfrey who first spoke of their involvement, not to the press, but in the quiet of the infirmary. It was the mother, she had said, adjusting bandages on the shoulder of a half-conscious student. Narcissa Malfoy brought a crate of blood-replenishing potions herself. Not a word, just handed it over and vanished. Others began to notice it too. Healers from St. Mungo's, still overwhelmed by the sheer number of casualties, were stunned to receive owl after owl with offers of help, but not offers of manpower, offers of materials, rare ingredients, freshly brewed potions, painkillers, healing draughts, and soothing balms of a quality even the ministry couldn't provide in such volumes. The letters were always unsigned, the crates marked only with a sigil, a serpent coiled in silver thread. One evening, Anthony Goldstein, a Ravenclaw who had taken a brutal curse to the spine, was being treated in the Great Hall. His screams echoed off the stone as Medi-Wizards struggled to stabilize him. From the shadows, a quiet voice suggested, "Try a draught of living death, a few drops, to put him under until you can repair the nerve endings." The voice belonged to Draco Malfoy. He didn't wait for thanks. He simply stepped back into the dark and left behind a vial with a seal that matched the serpent. They did it because they were trying to clear their name. Ron Weasley had insisted to anyone who'd listen. They only helped to stay out of Azkaban. But Hermione Granger wasn't so sure. She had watched Narcissa sit beside a girl in the hospital wing, Clara Boot, a Hufflepuff muggle-born who had lost her leg to a falling suit of armor during the chaos. Narcissa didn't speak, didn't touch her. She just sat there, hands folded in her lap, her wand unused, but her eyes tired and kind. There was one healer, Aldrich Thorne, who swore he'd seen Lucius himself stirring potions in an unused classroom, his silver-blonde hair tied back, his sleeves rolled up. The picture of someone who had not brewed in years, but was determined to be useful. "He didn't say a word," Aldrich said, "but when I reached for the bezoar, it was already in my hand." Even George Weasley, who could barely speak in the days following Fred's death, acknowledged the shift. "It's not about forgiveness," he muttered one morning to Lee Jordan. "But when I saw them giving that calming draught to a kid who used to be in Gryffindor, I thought, well, maybe they know they'll never be forgiven, and maybe they're still trying anyway." What made it more believable was the discretion. There were no public statements, no Daily Prophet interviews. The Malfoy Manor remained shuttered, but when shipments of Dittany or Phoenix Feather made their way into Hogwarts, no one could deny the handwriting that accompanied the vials was refined, elegant, and distinctly Malfoy. There was one night, late in May, when Hermione caught Draco outside the castle. He was standing alone near the forbidden forest watching the trees. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice wary. He didn't startle. He just nodded toward the trees. "They buried him out there, didn't they, the werewolf?" He meant Remus Lupin. Hermione nodded. "I thought he was a monster," Draco whispered. "But he died protecting a school full of people like me, so I thought maybe I could try to be different." She didn't answer. But when she returned to the Great Hall, she found her cot stacked with fresh bandages, potions labelled in careful script, and a bundle of magical herbs she couldn't identify. Tucked into the folds was a note. No charge, just use it well. It wasn't signed. Dennis Creevey, who had spent days searching for his brother's body, had found himself on the edge of collapse. He refused to eat, wouldn't sleep. The medics were helpless. It was Narcissa, again, who had offered a small vial of essence of lavender and thyme, brewed in a way that softened the edge of grief just enough to let him rest. He never knew where it came from, but he kept it in his pocket even after he left Hogwarts. Not everyone approved. There were harsh letters published in the Daily Prophet, some accusing the Malfoys of bribing their way back into favour. Others, especially those with family among the dead, refused to believe the sincerity of the gesture. But Kingsley Shacklebolt, interim Minister for Magic, issued no condemnation. When asked directly, he said, "Redemption cannot be demanded, only offered. What others choose to do with that offer is their own story." Molly Weasley, for all her fury during the war, had watched as Narcissa helped a little girl find her mother's wand in the rubble. "She didn't even look at me," Molly told Arthur later, "just handed the wand to the child and walked away." She paused. "I don't know if it was forgiveness, but it was something." During those weeks, Lucius was never seen during the day. But at night, by wandlight, he tended the greenhouses, sprigs of fluxweed and saprophoros bean, ingredients impossible to source elsewhere at that time, were quietly harvested and laid at the castle entrance. Sprout once swore she saw his silhouette through the glass. "It wasn't pride," she said later. "It looked more like penance." Andromeda Tonks, perhaps the one person who could have spat in Narcissa's face and still be justified, never did. They exchanged a glance in the hallway one afternoon, the hallway that still bore scorch marks from the battle. No words passed between them, but Andromeda didn't turn away. Some said Narcissa sent baby clothes weeks later, hand-stitched, old-fashioned. Others said it was a lie. But Andromeda kept them. One of the most surprising accounts came from Parvati Patil. She had been cursed during the battle and left with a long scar down her neck. No spell could remove it. She found a small jar of cream outside her cot one morning. When applied, the scar lightened, the pain eased. "The seal was a silver serpent," she told Padma. "I should have thrown it out, but I didn't, and it worked." It was Blaise Zabini who later confided to Neville Longbottom that Draco had paid for several students' parents' treatment at St. Mungo's, quietly, through a third party. "He never said it," Blaise shrugged. "But I saw the vault records. Gringotts doesn't lie." By the time the summer solstice came, the Great Hall was nearly cleared. The injured had gone home or to St. Mungo's, and Hogwarts stood empty except for its staff. But one final letter arrived by owl, addressed to Professor McGonagall. Inside, a list of rare ingredients, all offered freely from the Malfoy family vaults. A final gesture, a quiet farewell. "I don't expect thanks," Narcissa had said in a rare letter to Madame Pomfrey. "Nor do I ask for forgiveness. But if I can ease even 1 hour of pain, then perhaps that hour will weigh less heavily on the scale." And maybe that was enough. Not redemption, not absolution. Just a quiet, persistent effort to make something better out of something broken. A single, silver serpent left behind in the ashes of a war that had no true victors, only survivors, some trying to heal, and others learning, finally, how to help. Number 23. Draco donated Astoria's inheritance to charity. When Astoria Greengrass died, the world moved on, as it always does. Newspapers reported her passing with the cold detachment they reserved for once noble names now fallen into quiet. But in the heart of Malfoy Manor, something deeper broke, not just a life, but a legacy. And the man left behind, Draco Malfoy, once known for arrogance and cruelty, now found himself in a position no hex or potion could fix. A widower, alone with a child, and a grief too heavy for words. The public expected the typical, the old Malfoy way, that Draco would hoard the Greengrass fortune for himself, invest it, shield it, perhaps pass it one day to Scorpius with all the caution and greed that the Malfoy name had once symbolized. After all, hadn't Lucius taught him that power was to be preserved, not given away? That bloodlines came first, always? But something had changed in Draco, and the moment the will was read and the vaults unlocked, the wizarding world witnessed it. Draco did something no one anticipated. Without fanfare, without a press release, he summoned the goblins of Gringotts and signed over a sizable portion of Astoria's inheritance to a small, nearly forgotten foundation, the Starlight Endowment for Magical Childhood Illnesses. It was a charity Astoria herself had created in the years after the war, when she became increasingly frail, but insisted her suffering must serve a greater good. "Let no child suffer in silence," she once told Andromeda Tonks, who donated in Teddy Lupin's name. Especially those born into pain. Astoria had suffered from a blood curse inherited from her ancestors, a rare, degenerative, magical condition that no healer in St. Mungo's could fully understand. It drained her slowly, leaving her pale, thin, and often confined to bed, but she had refused to become bitter. "Draco," she had once whispered to him during a long night by the window, "if I can't live a long life, at least let me leave behind something that does." Draco never forgot those words. For years he had watched her weaken. He remembered sitting beside her in silence, holding her hand as her fingers trembled from magical tremors. He remembered her frustration when she could no longer ride a broom, or dance at the ministry gala, or even lift Scorpius when he cried. But she never wept for herself. She wept only for the children at St. Mungo's, who shared her fate but had no voice. "They don't even get a name in the profit," she had once said. "They're just cases, numbers, bed assignments." After her death, Draco stood in the sunlit drawing room of Malfoy Manor, staring at her portrait. She had requested no funeral, only that her ashes be scattered in the garden near the albino peacocks. There were no guests, no speeches, just Draco, Scorpius, and silence. But the silence didn't last long. The Daily Prophet caught wind of the fund transfer and speculated endlessly. Was Draco bewitched, manipulated by grief? Was this a political stunt? But the truth was far more human. Hermione Granger, now head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, was one of the few who saw through the cynicism. She had visited the fund's offices tucked away near Diagon Alley and found Draco there one morning, sleeves rolled, sorting through parchment. "I expected a donation," she admitted to him. "Not this." He looked up, his eyes older than she remembered. "I don't want her name to vanish," he said. "She made me better. I owe her that." The foundation grew quickly. With Draco's money and influence, wards were raised around the new children's wing at St. Mungo's, named the Astoria Wing. It specialized in arcane magical illnesses, cursed blood, hereditary hexes, magical degenerative syndromes. Healers were trained, research was funded, and children who once had no hope began receiving treatments long considered too experimental or too expensive. One such child was Maisie Blott, age 7, diagnosed with elemental saturation syndrome, a rare condition where the body absorbs too much elemental magic from its surroundings, often resulting in fevered hallucinations and eventual magical burnout. Her parents, both half-bloods with limited means, had nowhere to turn until they heard about the new wing. 6 months after beginning treatment, Maisie spoke clearly for the first time in 2 years. Her mother sent Draco a letter. He never responded publicly, but he kept it in a drawer beside Astoria's wand. Even Harry Potter, never particularly close to Draco, had to admit the change. "We fought on opposite sides," he told Ginny one evening, "but I think maybe we were all kids back then. He's not who he was." And in a rare conversation at King's Cross as they watched their sons board the Hogwarts Express, Draco mentioned the Foundation only once. "She believed in saving what others gave up on," he said, glancing at Scorpius. "I suppose I do too now." The Ministry recognized his actions, quietly awarding him the Order of Merlin, 2nd class, not for valor, but for philanthropy. Draco declined the ceremony. He sent the medal back with a note. She wouldn't have wanted a medal, she would have wanted more beds. Pansy Parkinson, of all people, was one of the loudest critics. "Draco's gone soft," she told Witch Weekly. "This isn't the boy I knew. The Draco I knew would never throw away gold like that." But even she couldn't deny that he seemed content. The sharp edges of his arrogance had dulled. He still wore tailored robes, still walked with poise, but there was a softness in his gaze when Scorpius entered the room, a quiet gentleness that came only from loss. Blaise Zabini visited him one winter, sipping fire whiskey in the drawing-room. "You never did explain it to me," he said. "Why not just keep it? Merlin knows your father would have." Draco chuckled, tapping his glass. "My father never married Astoria." Then he added, more seriously, "She taught me that power without purpose is a curse. I'm not cursed anymore." From the start, Astoria had warned Draco that she might not live long. When they married, many pure-blood families whispered behind closed doors, calling it a foolish match. "She's weak," someone said at a gala. "She won't bear him strong heirs." But Draco never flinched. He loved her fiercely, and when she gave birth to Scorpius, early, fragile, but alive, he wept in the corridor outside St. Mungo's delivery room. Narcissa saw him and said quietly, "You're your own man now." Years later, as he sat in the Foundation's office beneath a charmed ceiling that mimicked the sky, Draco watched new cases arrive. Names, children, worries, hope. Every week he reviewed reports. Every month he visited the wing. He spoke with Healer Gantry, who had overseen Astoria's care and now led the research division. "You're doing more than anyone thought possible," Gantry told him. Draco only nodded. "I'm just finishing what she started." Astoria's portrait, hung in the Foundation's main hallway, bore a simple inscription: "For those born into battle." Draco chose the words himself. Not every war is fought with wands. Some, he knew now, are fought in silence, in hospital beds, in research labs, in the hands of those who choose kindness over convenience. Even Rita Skeeter, once a vulture, couldn't resist writing a piece titled "The Redemption of Draco Malfoy." In it she half mocked, half praised his transformation, noting, "The boy who once sneered at Muggle-borns now donates to causes his father would have hexed him for." The article ended with a rare compliment. Perhaps grief can be a greater teacher than any spell. Scorpius grew up watching his father not just as a man of status, but as a man of purpose. When he entered Hogwarts, he requested to be sorted without his family name mentioned. The hat listened, sensing integrity. "You'll do well in any house," it told him. He chose Slytherin, not out of pride, but out of determination to redefine it. And still Draco grieved. Grief does not vanish, it transforms. He kept her piano untouched. Her tea set remained on the kitchen shelf, a bit dusty, but never moved. Sometimes, late at night, he'd sit in the music room, run his fingers along the keys and whisper, "I hope you're proud of me." In the end, Draco Malfoy gave more than gold. He gave his reputation, his pride, his legacy, all for the woman who taught him that love meant more than blood, that legacy meant more than vault, and that true nobility was not inherited, but chosen. And the wizarding world took notice, not with applause, not with parades, but with something quieter, more lasting, a name etched in a hospital wing, a child sleeping peacefully, a father standing still in the rain, smiling through the silence. Draco Malfoy had changed, and this time no spell was responsible. Number 24, Narcissa refused to report on former classmates. After the fall of Voldemort, the world did not rejoice. Not entirely. Celebration turned into silence, and silence into suspicion. The ruins of the Battle of Hogwarts still smouldered when the Ministry of Magic, restructured and vowing justice, began its search for collaborators. Files were opened, names whispered, and those who once bore the dark mark became targets of interrogation, regardless of their actions in the war's final days. Among them stood Narcissa Malfoy, elegant, proud, and silent. She came to the ministry under heavy scrutiny. Her name had not been cleared by battle, unlike Draco, who had survived by inches thanks to Harry Potter's testimony, nor had she publicly renounced the Dark Lord like others had tried. Yet her presence at the trials was not defiant, nor was it apologetic. It was restrained, thoughtful. She sat through hours of questioning without once raising her voice. They wanted her to talk, to offer up names of former Slytherins, to point fingers at those who might have once expressed sympathy for the Dark Lord, to drag into the light the frightened whispers that had echoed through Hogwarts corridors during those dark years. She refused. "Your son stood on the astronomy tower the night Dumbledore fell," barked one of the investigators. "You know who else was there. Names. Give us names." "I know who was afraid," she replied calmly. "But fear is not the same as loyalty." She was asked about Theodore Nott, a quiet boy whose father had been a known Death Eater, about Daphne Greengrass, who had vanished during her final year, even about Pansy Parkinson, whose trembling call to surrender Potter had echoed in the great hall like a betrayal. But Narcissa said nothing, not a lie, not a truth, nothing that could ruin someone's life. The ministry was not satisfied. Kingsley Shacklebolt, though more measured than his predecessors, was under pressure from the wizarding public. They demanded catharsis, a list of names to purge their pain, a reckoning. But Narcissa remained firm. "You are building your peace on vengeance," she told them once. "That's not peace, it's a quieter war." One day, Hermione Granger attended a session at the request of the Wizengamot. She watched as Narcissa was asked again and again about people who had shared a dormitory with her son. Were they at Malfoy Manor? Did they know where the Dark Lord was hiding? Narcissa looked at Hermione and said, "You of all people should understand that truth without compassion is cruelty." Hermione would later say in private that it was the first time she felt sorry for a Malfoy. They asked her about Blaise Zabini, who had always remained distant but proud, about Millicent Bulstrode, about Tracy Davis. "These were children," Narcissa answered. You now ask me to tell you if they should be punished for the fear in their hearts? I will not. One ministry official accused her of shielding Death Eaters. Narcissa's eyes, cold and steel blue, held his gaze. I am shielding no one, she said. I am refusing to become what we once fought against. It would have been so easy for her to save herself by casting others into the fire. She could have named Vincent Crabbe, already dead, but still a symbol of guilt. She could have accused Gregory Goyle or even Marcus Flint, who had left Hogwarts before the Second War, yet whose loyalty had always been in question. But she remained silent. Her most defining moment came when they showed her a picture of a frightened girl, Astoria Greengrass, accused of harbouring a fugitive during the war. Narcissa stared at the image for a long time before whispering, Astoria was 17. She hid her younger sister when the Carrows came looking for students who resisted. She is not your enemy. In that single moment, the room shifted. She wasn't speaking as a former Death Eater's wife. She wasn't defending a bloodline or an old alliance. She was a mother who had seen war consume the young. She had watched her son nearly die, not from a spell, but from being dragged into darkness by a cause that devoured everything. You must understand, she said softly, the line between the guilty and the terrified is not as clear as you think, and if you cannot see that, you are no better than those who came before. This wasn't the same Narcissa who had once walked the halls of Malfoy Manor in proud silence, who had hosted Death Eaters in her drawing room. This was a woman who had lied to Voldemort himself to save her son. Is he alive? She had whispered to Harry Potter in the Forbidden Forest. Draco, is he alive? And when he nodded, she stood up and declared the boy who lived to be dead. She had risked everything, not for a cause, but for love. Lucius, broken and bitter after the fall, wanted her to take deals the ministry offered. Give them names, he said. End this. But Narcissa turned her back on him too. She met with Andromeda once after the war, her estranged sister, mother of the late Nymphadora Tonks, now raising Teddy Lupin. It was an awkward, silent meeting. Narcissa had not attended the funerals. She had not reached out after the death of Bellatrix. Andromeda did not offer forgiveness, but neither did she slam the door in her face. You changed, Andromeda said at last. I had to, Narcissa replied. Even Draco began to understand. He saw his mother not as the cold woman who had taught him about bloodlines, but as someone who had walked through the fire and decided not to throw others in to save herself. He watched her sit with Lucius in their decaying manor, refusing to speak of the old days, refusing to glorify them. We lived in a house of lies, she told Draco once. Now we build with silence. The wizarding world didn't forgive easily. Rumours still clung to the Malfoy name, and yet, over time, whispers changed. Not about heroism, but about dignity, about restraint. Harry Potter himself once said, "She saved my life in her own way, and I owe her more than anyone knows." There were those who resented her silence. They believed she was protecting her own, that her loyalty remained with Slytherins, with purebloods, with shadows. But that was not true. Her silence was not born from old allegiance. It was rebellion. Against the hysteria, against the ministry's new inquisition. Justice, she once said, must not look like revenge wearing new robes. Years later, when Astoria married Draco, it was Narcissa who convinced the old pureblood families to attend. She did not plead or threaten. She simply told them, if we cannot find a way to live with the world, we will always be hiding from it. Perhaps the most telling moment came when she testified, voluntarily, on behalf of Severus Snape, posthumously. The ministry had reopened files about the late headmaster, questioning whether he truly deserved a hero's memory. Narcissa stood before the Wizengamot and said, "He protected my son when few dared. That is more than I can say for most." Her voice never rose, she never wept, but her words carried the weight of a woman who had lost her world and refused to rebuild it on bones. To some, she would always be a Malfoy, cold, calculating, aristocratic. But to those who listened, to those who remembered what she did not say as much as what she did, they saw something else. Not redemption, perhaps, but resistance. In a world craving retribution, Narcissa Malfoy chose restraint, and that may have been the bravest choice of all. Number 25. Lucius helped capture remaining Death Eaters. The war was over, but the ash hadn't settled. The ruins of Hogwarts still held the scent of magic, death, and desperation. Survivors wandered the shattered halls like ghosts, and ministry officials moved through the wreckage with stern faces and silent wands. Among them, cloaked in sombre grey, was Lucius Malfoy. Once draped in luxury and arrogance, he now stood humbled and broken, not by chains, but by the weight of his own past. And it was in that brokenness that he did something no one expected. Lucius Malfoy had always been known as a man of pride and power, a pure-blood supremacist who walked with the confidence of ancient lineage. But after Voldemort's defeat, he was a man who no longer inspired fear or envy. Instead, he inspired suspicion. His manor had been the site of unspeakable horrors, his family a sanctuary for evil. Yet, as strange as it sounds, it was Lucius Malfoy who stepped forward with a hand extended, not in loyalty to the Dark Lord, but in reluctant allegiance to justice. In the days following the Battle of Hogwarts, the ministry was overwhelmed. Many of the senior Aurors had died, entire wings of records had been destroyed, and worst of all, dozens of Death Eaters had vanished without a trace. These were not lowly thugs. They were experienced killers like Selwyn, Jugson, and Thorfinn Rawle, who knew how to disappear and strike again. It was Lucius who provided the key that would unravel their hiding places. He came quietly, under the cover of darkness, escorted by 2 unnamed hit wizards to the new temporary headquarters of the Aura Office. He did not demand protection or privilege. He did not bring a lawyer. Instead, he brought a leather-bound ledger, handwritten, meticulous, coded. It was a record of everything he had heard, seen, or suspected during the final year of Voldemort's rise. At first, the officials were skeptical, but within a week, his notes led to the capture of Jugson near Dover and the dismantling of a safe house in Knockturn Alley where Alecto Carrow had been hiding. Harry Potter himself witnessed the shift. "I don't trust him," he had told Kingsley Shacklebolt in the Auror tent on the grounds of Hogwarts. "But that doesn't mean he's lying." Harry had seen Lucius at his worst, grovelling, cowardly, willing to let a child die if it meant protecting his own. But Harry had also seen something else. A man who no longer believed in the cause he once served, a man who would do anything to keep his family from falling apart. Lucius did not offer everything at once. He returned again and again, each time sharing more details. It was he who described the ancient catacombs beneath Castle Tenebris in Scotland, where Augustus Rookwood had once whispered of secret tunnels and passageways deep enough to hide a dragon. It was Lucius who revealed that Mulciber had developed a habit of visiting a particular apothecary in Bruges, a detail that led to Mulciber's arrest in Belgium 3 weeks later. But perhaps his most significant betrayal was against Thorfinn Rawle, a former comrade who had once shielded Lucius from the wrath of Voldemort after the prophecy incident at the Department of Mysteries. Rawle had been hiding in the Albanian countryside, operating under the name Maxim Rudar. Lucius, through scraps of memory and snatches of conversation, managed to pinpoint the region and pass it to the International Confederation of Wizards. Roll was found and captured in an old shepherd's hut with 7 wands, a cursed goblet, and the bones of 2 missing muggles. Some saw Lucius's actions as mere self-preservation, and perhaps to a degree they were. The Malfoy family had lost everything: status, influence, and even trust among their own kind. Narcissa had lied to Voldemort. Draco had failed to kill Dumbledore. Their bloodline, once so feared, had become a symbol of cowardice. But those closest to the events knew there was something more complex happening. "He wanted to make things right," said Hermione Granger in a later interview with the Daily Prophet. "Not because he suddenly became a good person, but because he realized the world he helped build was a nightmare. Even for him. Maybe especially for him." Indeed, Lucius's change began not after Voldemort's fall, but during the final days of the war, when his own home became a prison. He watched his wife tremble under the Dark Lord's orders. He saw Draco used as a pawn. He felt his manor turned into a morgue. "This is not the future I was promised," he had muttered to himself once, pacing the corridors, while Bellatrix Lestrange screamed with laughter from the dungeons. It was that disillusionment that pushed him to action. He did not want redemption in the eyes of the world. He wanted safety for his son. For all his cruelty and coldness, Lucius Malfoy was still a father, and it was in the name of fatherhood that he broke the sacred code of the Death Eaters and betrayed them. One of the most chilling moments came during the arrest of Walden McNair. McNair, once a friend of the Malfoys and a regular guest at their table, had been hiding in the Black Forest conducting illegal dragon trading. Lucius provided a memory, drawn out in Dumbledore's pensive, of a drunken conversation in which McNair had described his hidden vault near the Forest of Bones. That phrase, seemingly poetic at the time, matched a real location in Germany known among old magical families. McNair was arrested within the week. To betray one's comrades is never a simple thing, especially not in the world of old pure-blood pacts and ancient alliances. The Malfoy name had once stood beside the Lestranges, the Knotts, the Averys, and yet Lucius turned his back on them all. Some called it cowardice, others called it wisdom. Kingsley Shacklebolt, then acting Minister for Magic, called it useful treason. And it wasn't without cost. An attempt was made on Lucius's life by the remains of the Blooded Wand Brotherhood, a splinter group of surviving Death Eaters. A cursed letter arrived at Malfoy Manor, disguised as a ministry pardon. It killed the house elf who opened it. From that day on, Lucius lived under the protection of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, isolated from both enemies and allies. Draco rarely spoke of his father's decision, but once, during a quiet evening at the rebuilt Hogwarts library, he told a group of younger students he did what none of the others had the spine to do. He gave up power for peace. You might not like him, but you'll never forget what he did. Lucius himself never asked for recognition. He declined interviews. He refused awards. The only statement he ever issued was a short one, recorded in the archives of the Wizengamot. A man cannot undo his crimes, but he can change the road he walks. Let this be my final step away from darkness. Years later, when the official records were unsealed, it became clear just how crucial his testimony had been. Over 16 arrests had been made thanks to information provided by Lucius. Several cursed artifacts were recovered, including a mirror once owned by Gellert Grindelwald and a necklace that had been used in the poisoning of a Muggle mayor. Some historians argue that without Lucius's cooperation, the remnants of Voldemort's army could have regrouped. The war didn't end at Hogwarts, wrote magical historian Elphias Dorr. in legacy of the Second Wizarding War. It ended when Lucius Malfoy walked into that ministry office and chose the future over the past. Still, forgiveness was slow. The wizarding public had not forgotten the years of cruelty, manipulation, and elitism. The Malfoys remained in quiet seclusion, occasionally seen at formal events, but never again wielding the influence they once enjoyed. Lucius aged quickly in those years. The silver in his hair grew thin, his eyes lost their sharpness, but those who met him noticed something strange. A man once feared for his pride now seemed weighed down by humility. In the end, Lucius Malfoy did not become a hero. He did not become beloved. But he did become something far more rare in the magical world, a man who chose to turn against his past, not because he was forced, but because he understood the damage he had done. He became, in the quietest of ways, a witness for the truth. And in doing so, he helped close one of the darkest chapters in magical history. As Harry once said in a closed-door conversation with Hermione and Ron, some people fight with wands, others fight with silence, with decisions. Lucius didn't save the world, but he helped stop it from breaking again. And that matters. Number 26. Draco became a mentor for bullied students. When Scorpius Malfoy received his Hogwarts letter, Draco Malfoy stood frozen in the Malfoy Manor library, the parchment trembling in his hands. For a long time, Hogwarts had represented everything complex in his life: ambition, regret, pride, and shame. Now it was no longer about him, but about his son. The memory of sneers in dark corridors, cruel spells whispered behind backs, and laughter echoing from the mouths of the powerful tormented him. He realized something horrifying. Hogwarts could be merciless. Draco had grown up under a legacy of superiority, steeped in the traditions of blood purity and entitlement. At school, he had passed on that poison to others, cloaking it in sarcasm and cruelty. He had mocked Neville Longbottom, jeered at Harry Potter, and ridiculed Hermione Granger for her heritage. But war changes people, or at least it offers the possibility of change. And fatherhood forced Draco to confront what kind of world he was passing on to his son. Scorpius, with his earnest eyes and quiet intelligence, was nothing like his father had been at 11. He didn't carry himself with arrogance. He didn't sneer at others to feel strong. And soon after arriving at Hogwarts, he wrote home about the whispers, about being called the son of a Death Eater, about the sniggers when he walked by, about how, even without doing anything wrong, he was being judged. Draco, reading those letters in the privacy of his study, felt a stab of shame deeper than he had expected. It wasn't just pity for his son. It was the realization that he had once been on the giving end of those same whispers. Now, fate had handed him the chance to make amends in a way he never imagined. Not through speeches or apologies, but through action. He began by speaking to Professor McGonagall during a rare visit to the castle. She was skeptical at first, narrowing her eyes behind her spectacles, but she listened. "People don't change overnight, Draco," she said, with the same sharpness that used to command classrooms. "What you're proposing requires time and patience." "I'm not asking to be trusted," Draco had replied quietly. "I'm asking for a chance to do something right." Over the next few months, he began returning to the castle more frequently, not for grandeur, but for conversations. He met with Madame Pomfrey in the hospital wing, spoke to Professor Sprout about safe spaces in the greenhouses, and even knocked, awkwardly, on the door of Professor Longbottom's office. Neville had opened the door, blinked, and raised an eyebrow. "Malfoy?" Draco had swallowed his pride and explained. "There are students," he had said, "who are being targeted. Not just my son, children of werewolves, muggleborns, kids with strange hair or no parents. I remember what that feels like, and what it means to be the one doing it." Neville had looked at him long and hard, then nodded. "All right, let's talk." So, an unofficial role was born. Draco became a mentor, not with official titles or duties, but with presence. He started appearing at Hogwarts twice a month. He would sit quietly in the library and let students approach him. At first, it was just Scorpius's friends, Rose Granger Weasley, Albus Potter, but slowly others followed. He became a figure students whispered about. "Malfoy helps kids now," someone had murmured in the Great Hall. "The Draco Malfoy?" One girl, a fourth year, named Talia Binns, great-granddaughter of the ghostly history of magic professor, had approached him in tears. She had been bullied for speaking too slowly, for wearing glasses too thick, for answering questions too often. Draco had listened to her story, then told her one of his own, about how he used to call Hermione mudblood, and how it had cost him his soul. "You know what I learned?" he had said to her, voice low. "Every time I called someone weak, I was just trying to hide that I felt like a coward. I don't want you to spend years learning that the hard way. You are strong now, not despite the bullying, because you're still standing." Word spread, more students came. A Slytherin boy who stuttered, a Ravenclaw whose robes were patched and faded, a Hufflepuff who had been hexed to sing every time she spoke. Draco listened. He offered no magic solutions, only stories, honest ones, and strangely that was enough. One afternoon, Scorpius stood beside his father as they left the Transfiguration classroom and asked, "Why are you doing this, Dad?" Draco paused, looking at the torches flickering along the corridor walls. "Because I remember being the one who laughed when someone fell," he said, "and I know now how it feels to fall and not hear kindness." This new Draco was different even from the man who had stood at Voldemort's side in a panic-stricken mansion. He no longer needed power to feel worthy. He didn't chase approval from the elite of the wizarding world. He looked for something quieter, something harder to earn: redemption. His work didn't go unnoticed. Professor McGonagall mentioned him at a staff meeting. Madam Hooch, who had once scolded him for cheating during a Quidditch match, nodded when she passed him in the courtyard. Even Harry, who rarely said more than necessary when they met at ministry events, sent him a note. "Heard what you're doing at Hogwarts. Thank you, HP." The ghosts of his past still haunted him, especially in the dungeons. He once sat in the very spot where he had mocked Ron Weasley's second-hand robes. This time he sat there beside a third year with burn marks on his hands, an orphan raised by muggles, frightened of both worlds. "You're not alone," Draco had said, placing a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "And you're not broken." He never claimed to be a saint. He didn't expect applause. In fact, many in the wizarding elite found his actions unnecessary. "You don't owe anyone anything," his mother Narcissa had told him. "I owe everything," Draco had replied, "especially to the ones I once ignored." Perhaps the most powerful moment came during the winter of Scorpius's second year. A Slytherin girl named Elira Moon had vanished from her dormitory after weeks of relentless bullying. A frantic search through the Forbidden Forest turned up nothing until Draco found her, curled beneath a tree, wand clutched in her fingers, lips blue from cold. He didn't speak at first. He just wrapped her in his cloak and held her while she sobbed. "I'm tired," she whispered. "They don't stop." "I know," he said, "but you made it this far. That means you've already won." After that, Draco's place at the school became more permanent. The Board of Governors never gave him an official title, but Professor McGonagall quietly had a bench placed in the courtyard garden, engraved with the words, "For those who listen when others are silent." Draco sat there often. Sometimes he brought books. Sometimes he said nothing for hours. But always there was someone who sat beside him. To some, he remained a controversial figure, too marked by his past to ever be a symbol of good. But to dozens of students over the years he became something different. A refuge, a confidant, a quiet proof that change was possible. During a late-night walk near the Black Lake, Scorpius once asked his father, "Do you think they'll ever forget who you used to be?" Draco smiled faintly. "No, but maybe they'll remember what I tried to become." And perhaps that was the essence of it all. Not erasing history, but rewriting legacy. In the end, the most extraordinary magic Draco Malfoy ever performed wasn't a spell, but a transformation, one that began the day he stopped seeing Hogwarts as a battleground and started seeing it as a second chance. Number 27, the Malfoys funded the restoration of the Hogwarts library. It began not with a proclamation, but a quiet letter. Delivered by an anonymous ministry owl to the desk of Headmistress Minerva McGonagall in the spring of 2000, it bore the Malfoy crest, silver serpent on emerald shield. The contents were brief but astonishing. An offer from Lucius Malfoy to donate 1.3 million galleons to the Hogwarts Library Restoration Fund. The castle had not fully recovered from the Battle of Hogwarts, and though the structure stood strong, the library, heart of learning and legacy, had suffered more than most knew. Charred shelves, shattered manuscripts, and lost records told a silent tale of destruction. What the letter proposed, however, was more than charity. It was a plea. A quiet attempt to rewrite a name steeped in suspicion. Minerva, as ever, was cautious. She summoned Lucius not to a formal negotiation, but to a walk beneath the Whomping Willow, where few lies could hide in open air. She studied his face, searching for arrogance, for the haughtiness she had known in his youth. But his eyes were distant, and something like weariness weighed his shoulders. "Hogwarts gave me everything," he said, "and I failed it. I want my family's legacy to be more than darkness." He looked up at her, pale as moonlight. "Let it begin with books." The war had ended 2 years earlier, but its ghosts remained thick in the air. Students still whispered in corridors, remembering the shriek of curses and the cruel silence that followed them. Many refused to use the upper floors of the library, where the enchanted flames had swallowed the herbology section and half of magical history. Pince, ever the protector of parchment, had wept openly at the sight. "It's not just the books," she said to Minerva once. "It's the memory of what we once thought invincible." The Malfoy proposal stunned the faculty. Not just the scale of the funds, though that alone would have rebuilt the entire East Tower, but the stipulations that followed. The new wing, which Lucius insisted be called the Aletheia wing, Aletheia meaning truth in ancient Greek, was to focus entirely on literature about inclusion, tolerance, and history of marginalized wizarding groups. We suggest a collection dedicated to the stories of Muggle-born witches and wizards, read the appended parchment, written in Draco's tidy script. Studies of magical lineage, treatises on magical anthropology, biographies of non-pureblood pioneers. It was Astoria Greengrass, Draco's wife, who had first planted the idea. A quiet but fierce witch, she had been appalled by the tales Draco shared from the war, the cruelty he'd seen and sometimes failed to prevent. After their marriage, she began collecting books that told different stories, magical theories from African scholars, diaries of Muggle-born students, ancient magical scripts from Asian traditions. She saw in them not weakness, but an untapped strength. "Knowledge," she told Draco one evening, as they sat watching Scorpius sleep, "is the only apology that echoes." The cornerstone of the new Aletheia wing was laid in June 2001. In a quiet ceremony, Lucius stood beside Minerva and Madame Pince. The press was invited, but few came, uncertain whether this was redemption or theatre. Lucius himself seemed indifferent to the public eye. When asked by Rita Skeeter whether he hoped to buy back public favour, he simply said, "Favour is fleeting, understanding lasts longer." Rita's quill hesitated, then scribbled a reluctant nod. The reconstruction took 7 months. Brick by enchanted brick, the new wing rose from the ashes of the North Annex. The spell-woven wood of the shelves resisted fire and mildew. Stained glass windows, crafted by goblin artisans from the Orkney Isles, shimmered with images of unity, centaurs reading beside humans, house elves casting charms, muggle children playing near broomsticks. The new collection included rare first-edition essays by Batilda Bagshot on non-European magical practices, and the private letters of Hermione Granger during her years as Minister for Magical Equality. Hermione herself was sceptical at first. Her last memory of the Malfoys involved wands drawn in Malfoy Manor, and pain that had never truly faded. But when she saw the titles being collected, The Muggle-Born Witch's Companion, The Blood Debate, Myths and Prejudices, Wands Across Worlds, her defences softened. "It's not forgiveness," she told Harry one afternoon, walking past the Alethea doors. "But it's a beginning." One shelf in the new wing bore a small brass plaque. "In memory of the lost voices, may their stories rise again." No names were listed. But those who had seen the war knew who was meant. Colin Creevey, killed for his courage, Hannah Abbott's parents, victims of blind hatred, even Severus Snape, who died in shadows to protect the future. "Books remember," said Pince, running her fingers along the plaque, "even when people don't." Draco Malfoy visited the wing alone a month after it opened. Dressed in grey, no longer the boy with a sneer, he wandered the shelves like someone chasing fragments of himself. He paused before a large volume, Mudbloods and Magic, a history of prejudice in the wizarding world. His fingers trembled as he opened it. Inside, in a child's handwriting, someone had scrawled, "Everyone deserves a wand." He did not cry, but he did not smile either. Scorpius Malfoy, though too young to read all the books then, would later write his own essay, Legacy of Flames, which detailed how the children of Death Eaters found peace in the pages of stories they were once taught to hate. "We thought knowledge made us superior," he wrote, "but it only makes us free when it humbles us." The Alethea wing became a haven. Students from all houses gathered there, Ravenclaws for study, Hufflepuffs for reflection, even Slytherins who often found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths. Pince, once fiercely territorial, softened. She allowed students to linger past curfew if they read from the empathy section, a place Draco had requested specifically. The wizarding press changed its tone slowly. The Daily Prophet first ran a skeptical piece, Malfoy Charity, Guilt or Gold, but after interviewing students who had used the new resources for their Newty theses, a follow-up article appeared titled From Shadows to Shelves, Hogwarts Library Reborn. The author, a half-blood journalist named Eliza Nettles, wrote, "If healing begins with story, then the Malfoys have given us a new chapter." Minerva McGonagall wrote a letter to Lucius Malfoy 1 year after the wing's completion. It was brief but sincere. "You asked once if this would change your family's legacy. I believe it already has." Lucius, now reclusive and rarely seen outside Wiltshire, reportedly had the letter framed above his study fireplace. In 2003, a fifth-year student named Mandeep Kaur discovered a misplaced journal in the Alethea wing. The journal had belonged to Penelope Clearwater and detailed her struggles as a Muggle-born during the final year of the war. Amandeep published the journal with the blessing of Penelope's family under the title Ink in Wartime. It won the Felix Scribner Award for Magical Nonfiction and became part of the Hogwarts curriculum in ethics of magic. Ron Weasley was less quick to forgive. When asked in an interview whether he would ever thank the Malfoys, he scoffed. They threw in a few books and want applause? But Hermione quietly countered. Maybe they're not asking for applause, she said. Maybe they're just adding something good to the world for once. Ron said nothing, but the next time they visited Hogwarts he spent an hour in the Alethea wing, running his fingers along the spines in silence. Harry, too, found himself there late one night, after a commemorative speech at the Great Hall. He found a book titled Magic in the Margins, Forgotten Voices in Wizarding History. Inside was a chapter about the war and a footnote about a boy who once hesitated in a hallway with his wand shaking. Redemption is a door we build ourselves, it read. Harry closed the book and sat down. He stayed until dawn. Not all agreed with the Restoration's message. A few pureblood alumni sent scathing letters. Revisionist rubbish, wrote Eldred Warrington, class of '68. But for every voice that clung to the past, 5 more rose in celebration of the future. The library hosted annual lectures on magical ethics, and the Alethea Scholarship, funded by the Malfoys, supported research into magical anthropology, no matter the applicant's blood status. One day, Scorpius, now a 3rd year, found a note tucked into a book on magical theory. It read, "My grandfather hated people like me, but his money paid for this book. Maybe that means something. It was unsigned." But Scorpius folded it into his journal and kept it. Perhaps he thought that was the true power of the Alethea wing, not in rewriting the past, but in planting seeds for a future neither side had imagined. In the end, it was a single shelf in the far corner of the wing that held the most borrowed book, From Prejudice to Promise, The Changing Face of Hogwarts. Students loved its final chapter, a quote from Albus Dumbledore himself. Understanding is the first step to acceptance, and only with acceptance can there be recovery. Perhaps the Malfoys, for all their sins, had finally taken that first step. Number 28. Draco became Harry's ally against a new threat. There was something haunting in the way Draco Malfoy stood beside Harry Potter, shoulders squared, face pale but resolute, as if all the ghosts of his past were watching, measuring this moment against a lifetime of mistakes. In Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, this unexpected alliance wasn't a mere formality or necessity. It was a quiet revolution. A man once filled with pride, prejudice, and fear stood now as an equal, not to seek redemption, but to do what was right. And perhaps that made all the difference. The truth was, Draco had changed. The boy who once mocked Harry on the Hogwarts Express, who sneered at Hermione's bloodline and parroted his father's poisonous beliefs, had become a man tempered by grief, fatherhood, and the hard lessons of war. He had lost more than the public ever knew, his illusions, his certainty, and worst of all, his wife Astoria. What remained was a father, fiercely protective of his son, and a wizard who no longer believed that blood determined worth. When Delphi Diggory, posing as the niece of Amos Diggory, unleashed her plan to bring Lord Voldemort back, the wizarding world barely had time to react. It was a plan woven with ancient magic, time-turners, and manipulation. Albus Potter and Scorpius Malfoy, both struggling under the weight of their names, became pawns in Delphi's twisted vision of the future. And it was this threat to their children that brought Draco and Harry together, not just as co-parents, but as comrades. Draco's involvement wasn't hesitant. He didn't stand behind Harry, watching from the shadows. When they discovered that Albus and Scorpius were trapped in time, lost in the past by Delphi's hand, it was Draco who provided the crucial piece, his family's own prototype time-turner. Unlike the Ministry's destroyed devices, this one allowed travel further back in time, a legacy of Malfoy ambition and secrecy. "We have something," Draco admitted, his voice low. "Something from my father's collection. It's illegal, unstable, dangerous, but it may be our only chance." This moment was a turning point. Draco could have stayed silent. He could have hidden behind bureaucratic walls, distanced himself, and let Harry handle the crisis. But he didn't. Instead, he opened up his world, even the darkest corners of it, and offered the key to saving their sons. He trusted Harry, and Harry, once his rival, accepted that trust without mockery or suspicion. "Thank you," Harry said simply. No sarcasm, no rivalry, just two fathers standing on common ground. There's something poetic in the way their sons mirrored and healed the wounds of their fathers. Albus and Scorpius, unlike Harry and Draco, chose to be friends in spite of their legacy. Their bond forced their fathers to look inward, to reconsider, and when Draco looked at Harry, he didn't just see the boy who lived, he saw someone who also bore the weight of expectations, who also lost loved ones, who also wanted to keep his son safe. When Delphi finally revealed herself, claiming to be the daughter of Lord Voldemort and Bellatrix Lestrange, both Draco and Harry were faced with the return of a nightmare they thought was long buried. Delphi was brilliant, manipulative, and consumed with a singular purpose, to fulfill her father's legacy. She believed that by altering the past, she could resurrect a future where Voldemort ruled, and she would stand at his side. She was not seeking power through politics or influence. She sought the impossible, the rewriting of destiny itself. To stop her, Harry, Draco, Ginny, Ron, and Hermione had to work together, navigating the twisted layers of time. It was dangerous magic. Every misstep risked erasing the present they knew. And yet Draco never faltered. He argued fiercely when he disagreed. He pushed back when he felt others were blind to risk, but he never abandoned the mission. He was a voice of reason, a steady presence in the chaos, and his insight often guided the group through the unknown. One of the most poignant moments came when they discovered Delphi's plan to travel back to the night before Harry's parents were murdered. She wanted to prevent Voldemort from going to Godric's Hollow, believing that doing so would alter history and allow Voldemort to rise unchallenged. It was Draco who understood the horrifying implications first. "She wants to stop him from killing Harry," he whispered, "so that the prophecy never activates, so that Voldemort never falls." It was the cruelest irony. By saving Harry, she would destroy everything he and others had fought for. The plan to stop Delphi required courage, stealth, and ultimately, sacrifice. They followed her to the past, disguising themselves, walking the shadows of a world long gone. And it was Draco who held the line when things began to unravel. He used every ounce of his cunning, his Slytherin instincts, not for personal gain, but for strategy, for survival. When he spoke to the group, it wasn't with condescension, but with measured thought. "This isn't about us," he said. "It's about them, about the children, about the world they'll inherit." What's striking in The Cursed Child is that Draco never once seeks recognition. He never asks to be called a hero. He doesn't want newspaper headlines or public applause. When the mission ends and Delphi is captured, Draco doesn't gloat. He simply ensures that his son is safe. He stands a little taller perhaps, not with pride, but with peace. A peace he hadn't known since childhood. The Malfoy name, long associated with power, fear, and darkness, had a new legacy now. Not one of villainy, but of quiet redemption. And that change wasn't forced, it was chosen. Draco chose to grow, chose to reflect, chose to act. When Harry asks him why he offered the Time Turner, why he stood by them when the Ministry turned its back, Draco doesn't offer a grand speech. He simply says, "Because he's my son, and because I'm not my father." That one sentence carries the weight of generations. Lucius Malfoy had once pledged allegiance to Voldemort. He had raised Draco in a home of superiority and fear. But Draco had broken that chain. He had refused to let his son inherit that darkness. He had fought not for glory, but for love. And in doing so, he rewrote not just his own story, but the legacy of his entire family. Even Harry acknowledges it. In a rare moment of vulnerability, he admits to Draco, "I'm sorry for what my kids said to yours, for how things were between us. You didn't deserve all of it." Draco, usually sharp-tongued, simply nods. "Neither of us were angels, Potter, but we've done right now. That matters." The strength of Draco's arc lies in its honesty. He doesn't become a saint. He doesn't suddenly embrace Gryffindor ideals or wear red and gold. He remains himself, complex, sarcastic, deeply private. But his moral compass now points true. He's no longer a boy chasing his father's approval. He's a man who understands what truly matters. There's a scene after the final confrontation when Albus and Scorpius return to their own time, shaken but safe. The fathers wait in silence, unsure of what to say. And when the boys appear, Draco does not run to Scorpius. He walks slowly, steadily, and simply places a hand on his son's shoulder. No tears, no speeches, just presence. A father saying, "I'm here. You're safe. I'll never let the world hurt you again." What makes this all the more powerful is that it isn't a sudden change. The seeds of this transformation were planted in the half-blood prince, when Draco was forced to repair the vanishing cabinet, when he hesitated to kill Dumbledore. Even then he wasn't evil, just lost, just scared. And in The Cursed Child, that scared boy becomes a brave man. One can't help but think of Severus Snape, another Slytherin who lived in shades of grey, whose bravery was often invisible. But unlike Snape, Draco got to see the light while still alive. He got to protect his son, not just mourn him. He got to fight alongside Harry, not from the shadows, but side by side. And maybe, just maybe, that was the redemption the Malfoys never knew they needed. In the end, when history tried to repeat itself, Draco Malfoy stood in its path, not with a wand raised in fury, but with a steady voice and an unwavering heart. He had learned that courage wasn't about pride or fame or bloodlines. It was about choosing to protect what you love, even when the world doubts you. There is no statue for Draco, no order of Merlin. But for those who understand what it means to walk away from darkness and choose the harder path of light, his story is one of the bravest of all. And in that quiet moment, with Hogwarts safe and the future intact, Harry looks at Draco and says, "We did good." Draco doesn't reply. He doesn't need to. He just looks at his son and smiles.